Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining. We will get started in just a couple of minutes as we wait for people to arrive. Excited to talk about shaving the peak today. All right, and we will get started now. Thank you so much for joining today. My name is Kai Salem. I am the Policy Coordinator at Green Energy Consumers Alliance, and I'm going to be talking to you all today about Shave the Peak, which is a special favorite program of mine at Green Energy Consumers because I helped develop it about 5 years now before it was acquired by Green Energy Consumers Alliance, and I've managed it ever since. So I've gotten to see this program grow. And thank you so much for joining. We're going to talk today all about how it works, what peaks are, and what we can do to expand peak shaving on the level of policy and collective change. So I'm just going to share my screen without further ado, and we will get started. All right, Shave the Peak 2022. So as always with our webinars, I'll just give a quick reminder that you are all muted, but if you have any problems or questions throughout the presentation, please do not hesitate to type something in the chat or in the question box. I'll do my best to get around to everything. We will have time for Q&A at the end. We are going to get into the technicalities of peaks today, so do not hesitate to ask any questions about the electric grid, renewable energy, and energy efficiency programs and more. It would be great to get lots of good questions in the chat. First, I'll talk a little bit about Green Energy Consumers. We are a nonprofit founded in 1982. That means that it is our 40-year anniversary this year. This winter, I think in December, there's going to be a big celebration of 40 years in Massachusetts. We just had our Rhode Island celebration of 20 years in Rhode Island and 40 years in Massachusetts. We'll be doing the same thing in the fall winter time for our Massachusetts members. We help our members access clean energy programs. We also advocate for policy that helps speed the transition to a low carbon future. I work a lot on Rhode Island policy, so I'm going to just note for everyone, tomorrow there's a vote in the Rhode Island House of Representatives to make Rhode Island the first state to reach 100% renewable electricity. If this vote goes through tomorrow in the Rhode Island House, then Rhode Island will be 100% renewable by 2033. This is the last of 4 necessary votes. So if you live in Rhode Island, please reach out to your state rep and ask them to vote yes. This is really now or never for this history-making piece of legislation. That's all I'll say about that. But again, if you have questions, feel free to reach out to me. And now back to peak shaving. Shave the Peak is our program that is all about greening the grid. Just some basics about our electric grid here in Massachusetts and Rhode Island. All of the New England states share a grid. It is managed by a central authority called ISO New England. ISO New England is a really weird structure. It's this nonprofit that is in part governed by the state governments, but the entity that it really reports to is the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission at the national level. Most electric grids throughout the country are governed by some type of regional transmission organization, or ISO stands for Independent System Operator. It is this entity that oversees the balance of supply and demand. This is really important because for the electric grid to work properly, and I'm not an engineer, so I don't really know what happens if it doesn't work properly, but for the electric grid to work properly, there always has to be the same amount of electric supply going onto the grid as is coming off the grid, as is demanded by consumers. This is really complicated because just think about how many people are turning on and off electricity all the time throughout New England. And it's getting more complicated as our grid gets more modern, because now we have sudden flows of solar coming onto the grid as clouds move around. There's just more sources of electric generation and more sources of electric demand with electrification. And it's all up to ISO New England at the end of the day, and also in part up to the utility companies to make sure things are reliable and keep moving, and everyone has access to electricity. And of course, the added challenge is that we are trying to decarbonize our grid as fast as possible, and we need to push ISO New England, our utility companies, and our state governments. Everyone has to be on board to decarbonize our electric grid as fast as possible. So now we'll dive into peak energy. On really hot summer days or on really cold winter days, we have events called peaks. And these are the days in the year when, for a few hours in the afternoon, electric demand spikes. Electric usage is way, way higher than normal. And I've used some helpful graphs on this slide to help explain this phenomenon. So these are screenshots of right from the ISO New England app. They have an app that's called ISO to Go, and it tracks demand throughout the day. So this fun curved line that we have here, let's see if I can get a pen to start showing this. The curved line starts at midnight, and this is how much electricity is being demanded in New England at midnight on June 17th, 2021. These are from last year. June 17th on 2021, I think this was kind of a sunny day, but it wasn't too hot, so people weren't turning on their air conditioning. There was no heat being used. I don't remember if it was a Saturday or Sunday, but if it was a weekend, then demand will also be lower. We know that it was a sunny day because in the middle of the day, we get this big dip in demand. That's because the sun was shining and all of the solar panels on people's roofs were powering the electric needs throughout the day in people's houses or workplaces. And so people didn't need to draw as much electricity from the grid. There was less grid demand because solar was running all throughout the day. This phenomenon is called a duck curve because in extreme cases, it can kind of look like a duck's back. So we see a slight peak in the morning as people wake up. They're turning on their coffee makers, they're turning on their lights. And then at 6:30 p.m., 7 p.m., solar is not working very much anymore, and everyone is getting home from the office. They're turning on their TVs, they're cooking their meals, Maybe it's a little bit hot, so some people are running air conditioning, and you get a peak. This is a daily peak. There's a peak every day, which just refers to the point in the day when the most electricity is being demanded. But because this was a normal day, it was June 17th, it was just not that hot. There was plenty of solar on the grid. It peaked at 15,000 megawatts. That's pretty average for New England. We very frequently a day will get up to 15,000, but it might be closer to 12,000, 14,000. All right, let's take it over to the right here. We have a peak day. This was a really, really hot day, June 7th, 2021. I think it ended up being in the top 5 to 10 of peaks last year, but it was a hot summer. Last year's #1 top peak was June 29th, I believe, and that peaked at 25,000 megawatts. I drew this nice helpful line here, 15,000 megawatts, to show that the only hours in which electricity demand was under the June 17th peak on that peak day were in the very early morning hours, so between midnight and 8 in the morning, when people just weren't using a lot of electricity. And because the day was hot and it was not as sunny, people turned on their electricity, they were cranking their electricity, and the peak got up to 20, I guess the real peak, that's the orange line, got up to 22,600 megawatts. I will say, I took these screenshots last year before there had been any real peaks. We typically wouldn't describe something as a true peak day unless it was over 23,500 megawatts, which this clearly isn't. There were a lot of peaks that were a lot higher than this, but I think it's a good illustrative example for how much higher electricity usage is on a peak day versus a normal day. So that is kind of what electric demand tends to look like on a normal day versus a peak day. And let's get off of this pen tool. Why does this happen? There's one really single driver for why peak days occur, and that is air conditioning. Air conditioning, if you have AC in your house, you know how much that bumps up your electric bill in the summer months. Air conditioning is kind of the biggest source of electricity. It's not a very efficient use of electricity. And when you turn it on a really hot day, everyone else is turning it on too. And that just drives up electricity demand up to twice as much a normal day. Peak days also have a big impact on prices. There's a few different reasons for this, and I'll describe a few of them. But I think the main one is that normal supply and demand concept. Prices go up when demand goes up and supply stays the same. So on a peak day, to power all of those air conditioning units running all throughout New England, ISO New England sends signals to power generators to turn on. And these power generators are also known as peaker plants. Peaker plants are not on throughout most of the year because peaker plants tend to be the most expensive generating units. They're only kept around all year for those moments when electric prices are so high that it justifies turning those peaker plants on. We'll talk more about peaker plants and why they're so bad later. But this graph shows that on days when demand is 2 times a normal day, prices can be 10 times a normal day. So there's really a disproportionate impact on prices driven by peaks. In fact, our whole electric system is sized to meet peak demand. This includes our transmission and distribution infrastructure. Let's think of this as a highway. I think I put, here we go. For those of you who are not familiar with how the electric grid works, we have power plants that generate electricity. We'll talk about peaker plants later again. And transmission and distribution refers to the poles and wires that get the electricity from the power plants to your home, to your business, wherever you're using electricity. Transmission and distribution have to be big enough to carry all of that electricity on a peak day. It doesn't have to be only big enough on an average day. And that means that, like a highway during rush hour, we kind of end up sizing our entire electric grid to handle those peaks. Back to this graph. This graph shows that yellow bar is showing how in a sample year, this is back in 2014, this is from a report from 2017. The data is not that new, but it's demonstrating how it's just a couple of days per year that demand is especially high, that our energy system is sized to meet. This is a really big impact on the prices that we actually see on our electric bills, because if you look at your electric bill, you'll notice that the distribution charge is actually the biggest charge on your electric bill. We think about electrons as being the biggest part of our electric bill, but we actually spend more money on distribution than we do on the electrons themselves, the supply. And so to cut costs on our electric bills, it's really helpful to keep the cost of distribution and transmission down, which we can do by reducing that peak. Again, from that 2017 report, Massachusetts reported that the top 10% of peaks, the top 10% of load hours, drive 40% of system costs. So that is the top 10% that is 4 times as expensive, and then the top 1% is 8 times as expensive. This is a huge thing that is driving costs for ratepayers. Now we're going to talk about the other big problem with peak demand, and that is emissions. And at Green Energy Consumers, we're really all about trying to fight the climate crisis and reduce emissions in line with our climate goals. That's why we, as climate advocates, are so concerned about peak and spend so much time thinking about how to address this issue. This is an out-of-date graph that I should update, but it does show the fuel mix on September 7th, 2017. Again, this is kind of a normal day. It's not a peak day. You can also see from the curve, again, we don't have a duck curve here. You'll remember that in that June graph I showed you earlier, there was a big dip in the middle of the day. There's no duck curve here. There's 2 reasons why that might be. First, this is from 2017 when we had a lot less solar in the region. But second, it could just be a cloudy day, so the solar isn't producing that much. You'll see that most of our generation comes from natural gas on this day, but there's also a substantial amount from nuclear, hydro, renewables. There was a little bit of coal on the grid on Tuesday, September 7th, but that probably would be less likely to happen now because coal really has been largely phased out in New England and is reserved for peak winter days and peak summer days. Although with some nuclear power plant retirements, we're seeing more coal. With the expense of fossil fuels, we're seeing more coal. So some complicated other issues going on with respect to whether or not we use coal here in New England. So the point here is that overall there's less fuel being used to power the grid on a normal day. We also have a bigger part of that fuel is from nuclear, renewables, solar, wind, hydro, and relatively cleaner power. Now we're going to show a peak day. Here's, I guess, an important point. We're talking about peaker plants. Peaker plants run on gas and oil, sometimes even kerosene. They're usually the oldest, most expensive, and dirtiest fossil fuel plants on the grid. They are a big driver of local air pollution. They are averaged, I think, in the 40 to 50-year-old range. These are inefficient power plants. They're expensive. If they weren't so expensive to run, they would be kept on way more often. These are dirty power plants. They're fossil fuels, and they're only kept around for these peak days, which is another reason why we're so concerned about peak demand. We want to reduce peak demand so that these dirty, polluting peaker plants can retire, or to show the market that these dirty peaker plants are no longer needed to be kept online. This graph I took from Rosemary Wessel from the Berkshires, so thank you, Rosemary, for putting some of these slides together. And this shows where there are peaker plants across Massachusetts. All of these communities are being polluted by peaker plants on those peak days. There are still new peaker plants that are trying to be built, even though we don't need them. We have other technology that can reduce the peak, like battery storage or demand response, like we're talking about today. But There is still a proposed new peaker plant in Peabody, and the folks up on the North Shore are doing a really great job trying to fight that peak. So perhaps there's someone on this call who can give us an update on where the fight against the Peabody peaker plant is. All right, so let's look at a peak day now. On a peak day, we do see a lot more fuel being used, and there's also a big bump up in dirty fuels like oil and coal. In 2021, 2022, on a normal day, there will rarely ever be oil and coal used. And yet on a peak day, that's when those coal plants start to fire up, start to generate, same with oil. There's also a lot of natural gas used. You could see, if we go back to that 2017 slide, there's almost an equivalent amount of nuclear plus hydro and renewables being used as natural gas. On a peak day, there's way more natural gas being used by any of those cleaner fuels. One interesting thing about this graph is you'll see that hydro goes from just a tiny bit in the morning to a huge amount in the afternoon. That is because of New England's largest battery, which is this reservoir in Northfield Mount Herman in Massachusetts. And this is pumped hydro storage. I think this is really cool. Basically, during mornings when there's less electric demand, the pumped hydro facility pumps water up the hill using electricity that is relatively cheaper and cleaner. And then in the afternoon hours of peak demand, it lets the water run back down the hill, which spins a generating turbine, which produces electricity to power the grid through those peak hours in the evening. So this is a clean battery, essentially, because a battery, it stores electricity in a way, it stores potential energy, and then produces electricity during peak hours. So we love this. You can't really make a lot more of these because it's hard to make new hydro sustainable, but this is just a really cool thing we have in New England that you can see the impact of on a peak day. I also wanted to note that solar is driving summer peaks later and later. So peak hours used to be from 2 to 5 p.m. and utility companies will often still say that the peak is from 2 to 5 p.m. or 12 to 5 p.m. or even 12 to 3 p.m. But in the last couple of years, every single year, peak hours get later and later. Last year, we saw that peak hours tended to be from 4 to 8 p.m. The year before that was 3 to 7 p.m. When I first started running this program, we were still kind of in that 2 to 6 p.m. range. So it's really cool to see how solar power on the grid is pushing back the peak. Here's another view on that. This chart is from ISO New England. It shows how solar power can be producing on a sunny day as much as 2,000, 3,000 megawatts. And given that, or I guess on this day, we're seeing, looking at the chart, yeah, over 3,000 megawatts. And that is really cool given that our peak demand tends to be about 25,000. That's a really substantial chunk reduced from our peak demand. Something we are not talking about a lot right now is winter peaks, and that's because winter peaks are more complicated for a variety of reasons, but winter peaks tend to be lower. They'll max out at around 18,000 megawatts, 19,000 on a really cold day, but they can be even more polluting. So a winter peak is driven, just like summer peaks are, by the thermal needs of heating in our buildings, or cooling in the summer, but heating our buildings during the coldest days of winter. Around 7 p.m., 8 p.m. on a winter day, a lot of buildings do run on electric heat, so there's more electric demand from the electric heating needs of those buildings, but also because it gets so dark early in the winter, there's a lot more lighting needs, and this coincides with all the other electric uses we have in New England, from businesses that are still running, people cooking at home, people running dishwashers, whatever we use electricity for. But winter peaks are a little bit different because they can be a lot more polluting. So On this graph, you see that natural gas we're actually using less natural gas than we were oil on this day in 2018. That's because on a really cold day, the natural gas, we have a limited supply of that in New England. We're limited by the pipelines that are coming up to our region. The natural gas primarily is going to heat homes. So before natural gas gets to be used by electric generators, it goes to heat homes and businesses and anyone else on natural gas heat. That means that the electricity generators have to turn to oil or turn a coal plant on because there just isn't enough natural gas supply to power natural gas generators. For the record, I'm not saying that natural gas is good. We want to phase out all fossil fuels as quickly as possible, and we need to be doing so. Just pointing out from an emissions perspective that if your choice is to run a natural gas plant or an oil or coal plant, you definitely want to choose natural gas. Of course, we want to be phasing out all fossil fuels. So to wrap up the mechanics of peak days, peaks tend to occur on the hottest or coldest days of the year. They are accompanied by higher than average electric costs, and they drive up electric costs because the entire electric grid is sized to meet the peak. In addition, because of the rules of supply and demand, electricity costs, so the cost of electricity on the wholesale market for electric supply goes way up because of supply and demand. Power plants turned on during the peaks, these are called peaker plants, tend to be the most polluting. They're the oldest, and we still have a lot of them causing local air pollution issues in Massachusetts and Rhode Island. By reducing the peak, we can start phasing out these old power plants. We can reduce our electric grid costs, and we can also reduce the amount of emissions that are coming from our power plants on these peak days. So we're going to talk about how we as individual consumers, but also as policy advocates and engaged citizens, can help reduce the peak. Number one, most important, we can anticipate when peak events will happen. We can do this by looking at the weather report. I check the weather a lot in the summer, and if I see a day that's coming up that's over 90 degrees or over even 88 sometimes, I will know that potentially a peak electric event is coming up. You can also predict it because after a few days of higher than average temperatures, building envelopes heat up, people get really hot, they get tired of being hot all the time, so they start to crank their electricity even more. We can also anticipate peak events by using the ISO New England publicly available data. ISO New England makes their own forecasts for how high the peak is going to be. They forecast up to 7 days out, and those forecasts tend to be pretty accurate. You can access these. This is what I use to call a peak event before I send out alerts. They're at ISO New England's website, or you can use their app, ISO To Go, which I really recommend. When we think a peak event is coming up, there are things that we can do as an individual consumer to try to reduce that peak. This includes conservation. I will run around my house and turn off the lights. I don't have air conditioning personally, but if you do have air conditioning, turning AC or an electric heat pump down or off is the single most impactful thing that you can do to reduce your impact on the peak. We can be more efficient. This helps to reduce our electric usage all year round. If you haven't already taken advantage of the free efficiency programs that are available to everyone, including renters in Massachusetts and Rhode Island, please do so. In Massachusetts, you can check it out on masssave.com, get a free energy audit. In Rhode Island, I think that the energy efficiency programs are in the process of transitioning from National Grid's website to RI Energy's website, but they should still be available on National Grid's website. We can load shift. Because peaks really only happen in that 3 to 8 p.m. window, we can charge our electric vehicles in advance of that peak window. You can pre-cool your home and then turn off AC during that peak window, or make sure to run your laundry machines or your dishwashers the next day when it's not a peak. There's also some technology that's available to help you shave the peak even more. Timed EV charging. I think they make it really obvious how to time your EV charging if you have a Tesla, but I drove a Chevy Volt for a long time where it's not obvious at all. But you can make it happen by digging around in the manual, and there should be some tutorials online. There's timed AC units, and we'll talk a little bit about how you can be involved in a Connected Solutions Smart Thermostat program in either Massachusetts or Rhode Island, where they will actually pay you to let them control your thermostat during peak events and help shave the peak that way. None of this is new. We kind of already talked about this, but by helping to peak shave, especially at scale, like just 2 or 3 people doing this doesn't make a difference. But if we get a lot of people in New England doing this, we can see an impact on the grid. There's cost savings. We're reducing pollutants from fossil fuel plants. We're moving towards a lower carbon grid. And this number 4 point, I think, is really important. And this is really why we do the peak shaving program. And we're actually going to get into this because of some upcoming events in Massachusetts that are going to make education of energy consumers especially important. We can help you do this. If you haven't already signed up for Shave the Peak, please do so. You can sign up at greenenergyconsumers.org/shavethepeak. You can sign up for either email alerts or text alerts. And the text alerts look like this screenshot right here. I'm the one who sends them usually. I'll let you know when, the day before, usually a peak day is coming up. Make sure to plan to shave the peak. The peak will be in this window. Sometimes the window changes depending on weather patterns or other things. So that is really the best way to get an update on when a peak day is coming up. We have leveraged this program extensively in our advocacy for policy and technology to support peak shaving. By running this program successfully and having so many of our members be engaged in peak shaving, we are showing policymakers that energy consumers are ready to peak shave, they know how to do it, and they want other tools to do it even better. And that is having a big impact, which we'll talk about in a couple of slides. But first, I mentioned Connected Solutions earlier. You can enroll a battery or a smart thermostat if you happen to have one in the program, and the utility company will call upon that device during peak events. Usually, if you have a battery, you won't even notice what the utility company is doing. They're discharging the battery into the grid during that peak event. And if you have a thermostat, you probably also won't notice too much because they will change the thermostat. So they'll turn up the thermostat temperature a couple of degrees, not too much of a noticeable amount during that peak event to reduce the burden of cooling on the grid. And you get paid for that. We love to see that. If you don't have a smart thermostat, but you want one, they also have incentives to reduce the cost of a smart thermostat. They're very cool. You can control them from your phone. I don't have one, but I wish I did. Similarly, with battery storage, I believe you can get incentives to enroll in battery storage. That's especially good if you have solar because it also gives you backup during outages. So we really do, to get to wider scale peak shaving, we need better policy, we need better technology. The single piece of technology that could enable peak shaving at a scale that makes a difference is smart meters. And we have been advocating for smart meters in Massachusetts and Rhode Island for a long time. They've been talking about smart meters in Massachusetts since 2010 almost, at least 10 years, and we still don't have them. However, that is looking set to change in the near future in both states. Smart meters have become the norm throughout the country. Most jurisdictions have smart meters, but for some reason, the Massachusetts BPU has been really hesitant, so we're really behind. What a smart meter does is it measures your electricity usage, not just once a month, but on a 15-minute basis, or sometimes shorter, depends on the technology, depends on the policy. By measuring electric usage at short intervals on that 15-minute basis, you can actually get charged for your electric rates and also get data on your electric usage throughout the month. So not just how much electricity you used in that that whole month, but what days of the week you were using the most, what times of the day you were using the most electricity. That's really important for peak shaving and for getting electric rates that compensate us for using electricity during times of the day that is better for the grid. Time varying rates send price signals to energy consumers, both residential and consumers and commercial. They also, smart meters enable us to see our energy data. For example, there's technology in smart meters that at least National Grid in Massachusetts has promised to deliver that starts to disaggregate load and can show you when you have a electric appliance that is malfunctioning, using more or less electricity that is supposed to. It can also show you how much your refrigerator uses, for example, as opposed to a toaster. So that is really exciting to see. There will be a customer data portal that the smart meter uploads to, where you can see a ton of new data about your electric usage throughout the month. This should help both customers and policymakers and the energy efficiency programs design better energy efficiency measures to reduce our electric usage and enhance peak shaving in particular. I am obviously a huge energy nerd and a data nerd when it comes to energy, so I'm so excited about the prospect of having all of this data at my fingertips. Green Energy Consumers also advocates for the incentivizing other peak shaving technology, like smart thermostats, battery storage, or EV chargers that have built-in peak shaving technology. So in Rhode Island, we're advocating for this through the development of the 2023 Energy Efficiency Plan. This is one place, the Energy Efficiency Plan is where the budget is set for connected solutions and for some of these incentives. We also really had taken big strides towards getting smart meters rolled out in Rhode Island back in 2018, when the utility company, National Grid at the time, agreed to submit a smart meter plan to our regulators, the Public Utilities Commission. They filed that plan in early 2021, so a year and a half ago. And then that was totally put on hold when National Grid decided to sell their Rhode Island electric and gas businesses to the Pennsylvania-based company PPL. That sale just went through in the last couple of weeks. It's now called RI Energy. PPL is rebranded in Rhode Island as RI Energy. They are committed to rolling out smart meters. They have a pretty advanced smart meter system in Pennsylvania that they're going to bring to Rhode Island. So it will take a long time to replace all of our not smart electric meters or dumb electric meters in Rhode Island with smart meters, but we're highly confident that it's coming. And it's great timing because most of our dumb electric meters are actually due for replacement. So we'll get smart meters, and hopefully soon on the heels of that, we'll have time of use rates. Smart meters are also coming to Massachusetts. Massachusetts is a little bit further ahead in the process because they didn't just go through this big electric utility transaction. Since last summer, Green Energy Consumers has been intervening before the Department of Public Utilities, which is the electric regulator in Massachusetts. And that docket, that entire smart meter planning process was kicked off by an order from the Department of Public Utilities that the utility companies had to create plans to roll out smart meters and develop time of use rates, and that they have to do it. So we've really been talking for the last year or so about what those plans will look like, but the rollout of smart meters is not in question. It does look like it's going to be coming to Massachusetts. Again, Massachusetts meters are due for replacement across the Commonwealth, so it's great timing. That public process is almost coming to an end. Green Energy Consumers have been closely involved. Throughout the process, we have been advocating for a faster rollout of AMI than AMI stands for Advanced Metering Infrastructure. It's the same thing as smart meters. We've been advocating for a faster rollout of smart meters. We've also been advocating for smart meters that have the baseline technological capability to handle all of the peak shaving strategies that we want to be able to leverage. We've been advocating for data to be publicly available and certainly available to municipal aggregations to enable time of use rates at the municipal aggregation level as well. And finally, we've been asking the utility companies to start sending out educational peak alerts this summer. Because once we get smart meters, there's going to be a huge amount of customer education done before we're ready to roll out time of use rates. The utility companies want to wait until the smart meter is installed to start that education process, and then they want to wait until after the education has been done to roll out time of use rates. We know from our Shave the Peak program that consumers understand how this works. They understand how to peak shave, and they're ready to peak shave. And so we don't need to wait for many, many years to be ready to implement time of use rates in Massachusetts. And in fact, the utility companies can be working now to do that customer education. And one way that we think that they can do that is by rolling out peak alerts in the style of Shave the Peak starting this summer. Peak alerts are a great way to educate consumers on when peak days happen, why they happen, and what they can do to reduce the peak. This is going to translate directly into responding to price signals in the form of time of use or time varying rates. So all of that said, I just talked for a long time. We're going to move into question and answer, but I wanted to highlight a couple of resources and action items for you all. First, our blog is a great resource, as is our website overall. We post policy updates on our blog. Right now, I believe the top blog on blog.greenenergyconsumers.org/blog is a blog about that 100% renewable electricity action in Rhode Island. So if you live in Rhode Island, please check that out. You can also support our work by donating at greenenergyconsumers.org/donate. Our advocacy program and most of the work that I do, actually I think all of the work that I do is run on individual donations as well as foundation grants. So we rely on philanthropy, whether individual or otherwise, to make this work happen. I also encourage you all to attend an upcoming event on Thursday that we're partnering with Mothers Out Front in Massachusetts to talk even more about peak shaving, what you can do to help, how you can expand shaving with peak beyond your immediate circle, and how you can write in to your utility company to ask them to implement peak shaving alerts as soon as possible. The link to sign up for that is on our events page. So to summarize this slide, check out our website because we have so much good information. I guess the most important other thing that I haven't mentioned is hopefully you all have already signed up for Shave the Peak. But if you haven't, I'm just going to type the link to sign up for Shave the Peak in our chat. You get the option when you click sign up through our website to sign up for email alerts, text alerts, to change the email that you receive alerts at, I believe, and more. Please share this link widely because the more people who are doing this Shave the Peak work, the better, the more of an impact we can have. And hopefully soon we can expand our impact by being involved with time of use rates and smart meters. All right, so now we do have about 15 minutes for Q&A, so please type your questions into the chat. I see a couple of questions already, so I will start going through those now. All right, I'll answer the question. When smart meters are available in Massachusetts, would the consumer have to pay extra to have the utility install the smart meter at their premises? No, definitely not. So throughout this process, the Massachusetts DPU, the utility companies, and the stakeholders have recognized that smart meters bring benefits to all Massachusetts electric consumers. They bring benefits to the utility company, and they bring a lot of benefits because they're helping us meet our Massachusetts climate goals. So absolutely not, consumers will not have to pay extra to have the utility install the smart meter. It will be the default, it will be rolled out statewide. There actually might be the opposite, where customers will have the option to opt out of having a smart meter, but because having a dumb meter means that that utility customer is no longer contributing to all of these grid services, like identifying outages or being part of time of use rates. If you opt out to have a dumb meter, you may be charged a fee for that. I'm not sure about the status of that part of the proposal, but that's because there are so many benefits to having smart meters that it should just be the default. We got the point in the chat. I love that someone checked this, that we could have a peaker event within the next week. It's supposed to be really hot on Friday in particular, so we could have a peaker event. We're going to be monitoring that and definitely send out alerts if that is the case. But weather can change, of course, so we try not to decide too far in advance. And we've got a comment from someone who also loves the hydro battery. I love the pumped hydro storage facility. We're going to need a lot more battery storage in New England in the future. It's probably going to not look like big reservoirs. It's probably going to look more like stacks of cells, lithium-ion cells, but so many different types of batteries out there that will all be part of what we need to see in the future. All right, any other questions? All right, we have a question here. Are Connected Solutions alerts available? Are events called when demand is higher than a specific threshold or when unexpected demand is greater than the forecasted demand for that day? Okay, great question. So for Shave the Peak, I call alerts based on factors including that specific threshold. We used either 23,000 or 23,500 is kind of our ballpark. But we also take other factors into account, like weather changes that we're seeing, or how many days people have already been asked to respond to a peak event, whether or not it's a holiday. I feel like we have a pretty good track record of calling peaks right, but of course, this is predicting, so it's impossible to get it right 100% of the time. We also operate a little bit differently from the utility companies when they call peaks, because we're really looking at that later range for peak events that we have seen in more recent years. Michael has a great point that oftentimes what drives costs, at least in the real-time electric market, is when demand is higher than what was predicted, because that unpredicted demand can drive big spikes in electric costs. But of course, because it's unpredicted, we really don't have a way to alert people to that. We're kind of watching that in real time as it happens, just like electric consumers are, just like the electric generators are. I wish we had a better way to predict or know more than everyone else does, but unfortunately we do not. And Kevin comments that there's some other great storage options, including pumped hydro. I mentioned earlier that pumped hydro, we really can't build much more hydropower in New England because it's unsustainable to create new hydropower. It can be really damaging to local environments. However, we can use that same concept of bringing something really heavy up high, storing potential energy by putting something really heavy up high, and then using gravity to produce electricity when that really heavy up high thing becomes a heavy down low thing. And there's a company called Energy Vault that is experimenting with using concrete blocks instead of water and using cranes to stack concrete blocks up high during low demand times, and then using the gravitational energy of those heavy concrete blocks to generate electricity during peak times. I think that's a really cool idea, and I hope to see that used more in the future. Someone says, if a customer has a solar battery bank, can they sell this energy to their utility company whenever? Great question. I'm also, that reminds me that there's something else that I didn't ask about solar, say about solar. A lot of people ask me, I have solar on my rooftop, do I still have to shave the peak? My answer to that is, you of course don't have to shave the peak, like we're not forcing you. And if you're really hot, turn on the AC. Heat can be really deadly. Heat waves are actually the most deadly climate impact that we're seeing. So do not shave the peak at the expense of your health and well-being. That's a side note. The point here is that if you have solar power on your roof and you shave the peak, then that solar power is going to run onto the grid and help shave the peak even more. It's going to power your neighbor's house. It's going to shave the peak. So if you have solar, yes, you can still do something good for the grid by shaving the peak and reducing your energy usage. However, if a customer has a solar battery bank, can they sell this energy to the utility company whenever? No, I think really the only way to monetize that is by being part of this Connected Solutions battery program. That said, if you have solar, you're almost certainly already enrolled in some form of selling your solar energy to the utility company, whether that's net metering or a feed-in tariff program like SMART in Massachusetts. That is, you're already getting paid for your electricity when it goes onto the grid. And I think if your battery is paired with solar, that probably wouldn't change too much. I guess you could decide to discharge your battery onto the grid. I'm not sure if you're able to control a battery like that. Great, and another comment, I love the engaged comments here, really smart. If when time of use comes around, you could, this is kind of what I was, getting what a better way of phrasing what I was getting at. If you want to sell your electricity back onto the grid at a key time, if you sell your electricity onto the grid in a time of use rate scenario when rates are really high and you have a net metered solar system, then you will get even more money back for that solar energy. Great point. All right, I'm not seeing anything else in the chat or in the questions, so we can end a few minutes early. But as a reminder, please check out our events page, our blog, and sign up for Shave the Peak. Tell everyone you know to sign up for Shave the Peak. We could have a peak day as early as this week, it turns out. So make sure to do that this week. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. My email address is on this slide, and I will get back to you as soon as I can. Thank you so much for joining today.